So in this video, we're going to be allowing a user to connect their Dropbox account with our application. So we can do things like upload files to their Dropbox folder and also download files, as well as a host of other things that you can do using the Dropbox API. Now, in the current state that you can see within my browser, my account is actually connected. If I head over to SQL Pro and just refresh there, you can see that I'm storing my Dropbox token, which gives me access to the API, to this Codecourse app which I've created, which we'll look at in just a moment. Now, what's happening here is every time we access a page that requires Dropbox functionality, in this case it's just index.php that we're going to be working on, it's going to check this token, and if that isn't available, it's going to redirect us off to Dropbox to authorize. Now, the way I've set up this test application is very much how you wouldn't do it within your project. You'd obviously have some kind of structure to your application, depending on the kind of framework you're using or just really how you've set up your application. But you can take what we learn and you can implement it into your application, have methods for checking if a user is connected, methods for returning the client which we use to access this functionality. So let me just invalidate my token. We can either just set it to some random text or set it to a null value or empty value. And currently on the index file, I'm returning the client, or I'm actually creating a variable which stores the Dropbox client. And if that can't be accessed, you can see that this time, because I've just invalidated my token, it's redirecting me off to Dropbox, and we're going through the OAuth 2 process to obtain a token. And then that's going to be stored here for future use. So I can either cancel this, which we're not handling, but that's pretty straightforward, or I can allow it. And what that's going to do is it's going to return me back to the authorized return URL, and that's obtained a token and stored it within my account. And now, rather than being redirected off, we can use any of the functionality to access uploading files, downloading files, whatever we need to do. So in this video then, we're actually going to look at setting up the PHP SDK for Dropbox. Very, very straightforward, just a simple composer download. We're going to be setting up our app on Dropbox, providing the keys, connecting the user, and going through this process to authenticate them, as well as storing it in the database. So let's get going and do that so we can do some really cool things with Dropbox. So before we get started then, you're going to need a Dropbox account, so go ahead and sign up if you haven't already. And then what we're going to do is head over to the developers area where we can create an app. So this app is going to give us some keys which will allow us to authorize the user. Your app basically represents exactly what it says, which is your actual application. So once we've hit create app, it asks us what type of app we want to create. Now, we're not going to be using drop-ins and we're not going to be talking about them. What we are going to use is the Dropbox API app, and this allows us to use the Sync API, Data Store, or Core API, and this is the one that we want. So it asks us what type of data we need to store. We can either use data stores, which we're not going to be going into, but they're quite interesting if you want to have a look. We're interested in files here, so we can actually take files from our application and store them in a user's Dropbox. And it says, can your app be limited to its own folder? This depends on if you need to access files already on the user's Dropbox by picking a specific folder, maybe a user's already created a folder. But in our case, what we're going to be doing is within the app directory, you can see at the moment I've got this open in my text editor, apps, that will sit within your core Dropbox folder, and we'll have a folder created of our application name that stores files, and usually this is okay. So we want to provide a app name. In this case, I'm just going to choose Codecourse. If the name of the app you're trying to create already exists, it will alert you, so you won't be able to create an app that already exists in terms of its name. And there's not really much here that we need to set up. The only thing we need to concentrate on is the redirect URI. We're not allowing implicit grants. You can read about that more if you hover over this I. So we're going to disallow this. It does mention if your application doesn't use the implicit grant flow, it's safer to disallow it entirely. We can also generate an access token if we want to. We're not going to be doing that because we're going to be doing that on a user basis. And you can use webhooks as well. So we need to figure out where we're going to redirect the user once they've clicked that allow button on that OAuth process. So we need to create a few files within this Dropbox API folder. You can see at the moment in here I'm just on index.php, which happens to just be an empty file. And we also have here an empty files folder, which we're going to be storing files later down the series, which we can copy to the user's Dropbox account. So what we want to do then is create a new file here, which is going to be the point which our user lands on in order for us to authenticate them. So I'm just going to call this Dropbox_finish.php. I'm doing this on a file by file basis just to make it a little bit easier for this tutorial, but you'd likely have some kind of routing system, maybe /Dropbox finish or something like that, and that passes you off to maybe a controller, and then you can do this in a really nice clean way. So now we know the location of the endpoint that we're going to end up at. This is Dropbox_finish.php. We can copy this URL and just paste it in. So we can use HTTP for localhost, but if you look at the placeholder here, it says that it must be an HTTPS if it's live. So if you are doing this live, you're going to need to have HTTPS to be able to do this. So if we hit add there, that's been added. So that now is an authorized redirect URI, and we can carry on with the rest of it. So we're going to be creating a new folder in this directory, and we're going to call this app, and we're going to have a folder file inside of here, called start.php, and that's basically going to set up the API, pass all the information that we need so we can actually connect to the API. But we need to actually pull down the PHP SDK for Dropbox to be able to actually use this, and this makes things a lot easier. So I'm going to create a composer.json file, and we're going to require in as a dependency Dropbox/Dropbox SDK, and we'll pull in 1.1.star here. So you can find this over on the Dropbox GitHub page, and you can see a little bit more about it here, as well as look at some examples. And it's obviously available on Packages. We're going to be downloading this with Composer. So at the moment we're pulling in 1.1.star, so anything with 1.1 but then incremental versions up here. And you will obviously need Composer installed. If you don't already, head over to getcomposer.org to download it. So over in our terminal then, we want to install that dependency. So we just run composer install and wait for that to finish. And that shouldn't take too long, so it's pretty quick. Now we have the ability to include this in. You'll notice that we have our vendor folder created with this in here, and you can go ahead and browse the code if it helps. It's quite useful to take a look at it. So inside of start then, we want to require the base directory here, and we want to go back one into vendor, and we want to include PHP autoload, Composer's autoloader. If you're familiar with Composer, this will make complete sense to you. But basically what we're doing here, if you're not familiar with Composer, is we're pulling in all the dependencies and configuration that we set inside of composer.json. In our case, it's just pulling in the Dropbox SDK. So what I also want to do is I want to start sessions, and I want to fake a user being signed in. So user ID equals 1. So within your authentication system, you would obviously be able to, however you're doing this, access the current user's ID that's signed in. And this is important because when it comes to creating our users table inside of this database, we need to be able to store the token there for future use. Otherwise, every time a user accesses our application, we're going to have to ask them to re-authenticate with Dropbox, and that's pretty annoying. So now that we've done that, we're going to define some API details. Now Dropbox is namespaced under Dropbox. So all we need to do is every time we call our class under Dropbox, we just use the Dropbox root namespace. So what we're going to do here is just quickly create some variables. Dropbox key, and that's going to be a string. And we have a Dropbox secret, and we can find them within our application area. And we also want to give this an app name as well. This just identifies your app and the version. So I'm going to call this Codecourse 1.0. So over in our Dropbox area here, our developer console, we can grab our app key. So let's copy that and just paste it into here. And let's copy this as well and just paste that into there. So now what we can do is call the app info class, passing in the Dropbox key, passing in the Dropbox secret, and then we can go ahead and use the WebAuth class to authenticate. So app info is going to be a new Dropbox / app info, and this takes two parameters or arguments, which is Dropbox key and Dropbox secret. So if we go over to index now and we require in that file that we've just edited, apps/start.php, we don't see anything, but let's go over to index. There we go. So we've now got our index page, and that should all be good. So let's carry on. Now, another thing that we need to do is when we're authenticating, we have a cross-site request forgery token that we generate. And that allows to prevent against cross-site request forgery attacks by validating it when you send your user to Dropbox. So much like you'd find on a form somewhere, this just helps prevent cross-site request forgery. So we want to store a cross-site request forgery token. So I'm going to call this cross-site request forgery token store, and that's going to be a new under Dropbox array entry store. And this takes again where you're storing this, and then the type of token you're accessing, in this case, or asking for. In this case, it's Dropbox auth cross-site request forgery token, and we can use that to validate a little bit later on. So now what we want to do is define the auth details. Remember, we've provided the app info, so we've got that stored. Now we need to actually set up web authentication. So it's a new Dropbox web auth. And in here, we pass the app info, which we provided up here. We pass in our app name. Now we need to, in here, pass the redirect URI for when the user finishes. And we know what that is because we pasted it in here just a moment ago. So we can actually copy this again and just paste it into there. Now all of this information will probably be better stored in some kind of configuration within your application, just so it's easier to change. Obviously at the moment we're doing things very procedurally, but you'd want to go ahead and tidy this up. So we're going to store the cross-site request forgery token store, or pass the cross-site request forgery token store variable in there. So now that we've done that, what do we need to do? Well, the first thing I want to do before anything is actually create our users table and create a user on here. And then we'll go ahead and connect to our database. So I'm going to create a users table. You probably already have one. And I'm going to store, in this case, just a username. That will be a varchar, say 20. And we want to store our Dropbox token here as well. And I'll just set this to a varchar 255, but it is much smaller. And this might be better in another table as well, and you might want to join this in order to check it. That's absolutely fine. For simplicity, we'll put it in the same table. So now that we have that structure set up, let's just create our username. We've now got an ID of 1. Remember, we stored that just up here. And we have an empty Dropbox token. So we've got nothing in there, and that's absolutely fine for now. So let's set up a connection to our database. Let's use PDO for this. And our driver is going to be MySQL. The host is localhost. The database name is site. And we have root and root as our username and password. So let's now grab the user details just so we can check our Dropbox token if it exists. So we'll do a quick prepared statement on our table. So let's select everything from the users table where the ID of the user is user ID. So this is a placeholder here. What we can then do is execute that. So user execute, and we can pass in the name of the placeholder as the key in this array, and then the value, which is obviously coming from our session. And then we can set user to user fetch object, and that will give us an object back with the user details. So if we were to do a var dump of user, you will see that that will contain, let's just double check this. Of course, sorry, I used a comma here. So that should give us back the user details. We've got an ID of 1, username of Alex, and Dropbox token of null. So we can use that to check if the token exists, and if not, send the user off to Dropbox. So we'll do that within another file in app. Again, you probably wouldn't do this in reality. It would be some kind of method or function just to check the status. And what we're going to do here is set a client variable, which is going to be accessing the Dropbox API in order for us to upload and do all the cool stuff like that. So we'll call this Dropbox auth.php, and we won't put anything in there just yet, but on the index page we're going to require that in. So app Dropbox auth.php, and that will allow us to, on any page that we want to do some kind of thing with the client, so upload or whatever, we can just include this file. So this file is going to, number one, check if the user has a Dropbox token. If they don't have a Dropbox token, or if the token is invalid, and that's really important, we can send them off to the auth URL which we saw at the start of the video. Now, why would a user not have a valid access token? Surely if they've gone through the process of authenticating and coming back, we've stored the token and everything should work, right? Well, what if they go into their settings in their Dropbox account and remove your application? That means that they no longer are tied to your application. They would have to re-authenticate, and that is when a token would be invalid. So it's good to think about these things. If a user removes your app from their settings and they come back to your app, they should have to re-authenticate. So what we're going to do in here then is we're going to check if user Dropbox token is available. And if it is, we want to get the client, and we'll do that a little bit later on. But for now, if they don't, we want to generate an auth URL and redirect them to that URL. Now we're going to have a little bit of duplication here. Again, this is what I said. Normally in an application, you'd extract the what we're doing in else to a method, just so it's easier to call from anywhere else in your application. But for now, because we're just learning about this stuff, we'll just duplicate our code up, and you'll see what I mean in a minute if that doesn't make sense. So WebAuth start, and remember WebAuth is what we provided in the start file just here. So that's the new WebAuth passing all our details in, including the redirect URI. So start is going to return us with a URL to access or to start the OAuth process. So we can just say header, location, and append on auth URL, and we can just exit the page there. So when we visit index now, we've set up our app in start. We are using Dropbox auth, which is essentially acting as a method to check if the user is authenticated with this. Otherwise, we're going to redirect them off. So we should now see us redirected off to Dropbox. Perfect. So what we're going to do here is click allow and see what data we get back. So you can see we've come back to Dropbox finish.php. We know that should be the case. We've got a state here, and the state is actually the cross-site request forgery token. And these need to match in order to be able to authenticate us, just so we're protecting against cross-site request forgery. And the code here is what we're going to use to obtain our token. So what we need to do then is a little bit more work over on Dropbox Finish because we're not actually doing anything with the data that's been sent back yet. So this is no longer going to work. We're going to have an invalid token now because they're generated obviously as we come back. So let's go over to index.php and just leave this where it is for a moment. We can always refresh that page. So under Dropbox Finish then, we want to require in app start so we can use the functionality we've already built in there. And we're going to call the finish method on WebAuth. So over in Dropbox Auth, we're using WebAuth to start the process, and here we want to finish the process. So for that, we use WebAuth finish, and we pass in where these details are coming from, so the token and the code. And in this case, they're coming from get. And what we're going to do is we're going to use list to actually list out what we want back from this method. So in this case, it's just the access token. So we now have access to an access token variable, which has been returned from this finish method, taking into account the details that we've brought back. So we can now store that token into the database to use for future requests to the API. So let's create a query or a prepared statement here. So we're going to say insert into, rather not insert, we want to update users set Dropbox underscore token equals Dropbox token. That's one placeholder. And we obviously want to do that where the user ID is the currently signed in user. So now we want to execute that, passing in them variables. So we'll say Dropbox token is the access token we've got back. And the user ID is obviously from our session, our fake logged in user. And then we'll just redirect the user back to index.php. So you can obviously do anything you want here, but the basics of it are this and the storing. So now let's actually go back to, say, our index page. We've been redirected, hit allow, and we come back. It might take a little while because we're just doing a few authorization stuff. And it looks like we're getting redirected straight back, and that's probably because something has gone wrong and it's not storing our token. So it's redirecting itself back. So we've probably made a mistake somewhere. Let's just check this. And there we go. I've put a comma just in there. So that query would have failed. So let's try this just again. Let's go back to our app, over to index.php, hit allow. And there we go. So we're now landed on index.php. We're not being redirected back to Dropbox anymore because that token exists. But what happens if this token is invalid? Well, in this case, what's going to happen with what we've currently got in Dropbox Auth is we're checking if the user has a Dropbox token, but we're not getting the client, and therefore we can't validate that the token is actually correct. So we need to do this now. And by creating a variable that holds the client, we're then able to use methods to upload and stuff like that. So we'll say client equals new Dropbox client. And in here, we need to pass in the Dropbox token. Remember, that's coming from the user's Dropbox token field. So in this case, we can just say user Dropbox token. We need to pass in our app name. Remember, that was stored in here as a variable. This just goes to show that the configuration route is a lot better because you don't have to have all these variables floating around everywhere. And we also want to define the character encoding. In this case, I'm going to choose UTF-8. So this in itself won't error. So if, for example, I was to either remove this token or just make it invalid, so I've just removed a big chunk of that, you'll notice that we won't actually get an error because we're not actually sending any requests to the API. We've created our client, but we're not sending any requests. So how do we send a request to the API? Well, we just use the client. So we say client, for example, get account info. If you need a hand finding out which methods are available, they're documented really, really nicely on the Dropbox website. But otherwise, you can just head over to client.php and you can see a list of the methods in here. So, for example, in our case, we have, let's just head over to get account info. And there it is. So that creates the request and returns JSON with the response body. So how do we know if this is going to error? Well, it will error now. We'll see, we'll get a message, but we'll get an uncaught exception. So there we go, we've got an uncaught exception, and this is the exception name is exception invalid access token, which we know because I just removed a chunk of it. So now what we can do is we can wrap this in a try catch to actually catch that exception and then do something. So let's copy and paste this exception name and just paste that into here, and we'll call that E. We don't really need to do anything with this because we know the nature of the exception that's been thrown. So what we want to do is, if it is an invalid access token, we want to do the same as we've done here. So again, I'm duplicating code here. It's really important to note that this is not a good idea. You want to extract this to some kind of method or function to be able to just call this whenever you need to start the authentication process. So we're doing exactly the same thing here, but the client is now available to us if this doesn't error. So let's check this out. When I hit index.php, that's automatically going to throw that exception, redirect us back off to Codecourse, the app, to validate. So I hit allow, that's going to redirect me back, the same thing that we've already seen, and we're now storing a valid access token. So let's just take a little peek at this account info here. You could go ahead and store this account info if you wanted to in a database just to keep it on your end. But let's just play around with this. So we know we have access to this client variable now because we've included it in Dropbox auth. So I can say now get account info. That will error if we output it. So we need to do a var dump on this or a print r. And you'll now see my account information. So we have got a display name, which is my full name, my user ID, whether my email address has been verified, if I'm part of a team, my country, my email, useful things like that if you need them. But in the next video, we're going to look at actually uploading files to the user's Dropbox account. At this point, it's also good to know that this Codecourse folder has automatically been created within my Dropbox account. So if you are following along, check out the apps folder within your Dropbox account, and you should now see a folder name relating to your application name. Let's go ahead now in the next video and look at uploading files.